19 soldiers and officers were charged. 11 were court-martialed. 1 was convicted. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. Those numbers come from Abu Ghraib, but they could describe almost every chapter in this story. What follows is drawn from congressional testimony, military tribunals, and declassified government documents. Not allegations, not theory. This is a pattern that the United States government's own investigators confirmed, across 6 countries, on 3 continents, over the course of 150 years. Every time the official version came first, every time the documented record came after, and every time, nearly no one went to prison. Here is the record. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led U.S. troops toward a Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek in Colorado Territory. Chief Black Kettle had brought his people there after U.S. authorities told him the location was safe. He raised an American flag above his lodge and placed a white flag of peace beneath it. Most of the warriors were away from camp. The people who remained were women, children, and men too old to fight. Chivington attacked regardless. Witnesses testified before a congressional inquiry that women and children were shot at close range. Bodies were mutilated. Fingers and ears were cut off as trophies. One account described a child wandering alone in the sand, while soldiers took turns trying to shoot him. The Army's initial report called it a victory. Chivington publicly claimed between 500 and 600 warriors killed. Other accounts placed the true number closer to 150, most of them women and children. 3 separate investigations followed. A congressional inquiry called it a foul and dastardly massacre. Captain Silas Soule, who had ordered his men to stand down and refuse to fire, gave testimony before investigators. He was murdered in Denver shortly after. No one was court-martialed. Chivington had already resigned his commission. But here is what matters about Sand Creek. It was not an aberration. It was not a rogue commander acting alone outside the chain of command. 30 years later, thousands of miles away, in a different ocean, under a different flag, the same sequence appeared with the same orders and the same outcome. During the Philippine-American War, Filipino fighters killed 54 American soldiers in the Balangiga Massacre of 1901. The island of Samar became a problem that needed solving. General Jacob H. Smith received his assignment and communicated his orders without ambiguity. Kill everyone capable of bearing arms. When Marines asked what that meant, he specified boys as young as 10 years old. He wanted Samar turned into, in his own words, a howling wilderness. No prisoners were to be taken. Major Littleton Waller reported that his men burned 255 homes and killed 39 people in 11 days. Broader estimates of civilian deaths across Samar range from 2,000 to 2,500. In the province of Batangas, General James Franklin Bell built a network of concentration camps designed to starve the insurgency by cutting it off from civilian support. Residents were required to carry identification papers. Anyone found outside the camps without them could be shot on sight. Between January and April of 1902, 8,350 people died inside those camps. In some, 1 in every 5 prisoners died from disease, starvation, or both. Smith was court-martialed in May 1902, not for murder, not for war crimes, for conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. He was found guilty. His punishment was a formal reprimand. He was quietly forced into retirement shortly after. Waller, court-martialed separately for ordering the execution of 11 Filipino porters, was acquitted by a military court. No one was imprisoned. But neither case closed the pattern. Both produced exactly what Sand Creek had produced: investigations that confirmed atrocities, charges that led almost nowhere, and a return to normal. In late July 1950, the Korean War was 6 weeks old. U.S. commanders were afraid that North Korean soldiers were disguising themselves as refugees to infiltrate American lines. Declassified documents showed that some commands did more than take precautions. Written orders authorized troops to fire on civilian groups approaching U.S. positions. When waves of South Korean refugees reached U.S. lines near the village of Nogun-ri, they were stopped, searched, and grouped near a railway bridge. American aircraft fired on them first. Ground troops opened fire next. Survivors were driven into the culverts beneath the bridge and held there under sustained fire for 3 days. Families piled bodies on top of one another for cover. A South Korean government inquiry later confirmed 163 dead or missing by name, 55 wounded, and concluded the true total was likely between 250 and 300. Nearly half of the confirmed dead were children. For decades, survivors said nothing. South Korea's authoritarian governments made speaking out dangerous. It was not until 1999 that an Associated Press investigation exposed the story worldwide, interviewing survivors and veterans who had been present. The reporting won a Pulitzer Prize. The U.S. Army's 2001 report acknowledged that civilians had been killed by American air and ground fire and described the killings as a tragic accident of war, with no orders to deliberately target civilians. South Korean investigators concluded otherwise. They pointed to consistent survivor testimony, missing Army records, and a letter dated July 26, 1950, from the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, reporting that the military had adopted a policy of shooting civilian groups approaching its lines. That letter had been deliberately omitted from the Army's official report. No one was ever charged in connection with the deaths at Nogun-ri. On March 16, 1968, units of the U.S. Army's Americal Division entered the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai during a search-and-destroy operation. Soldiers later testified that their orders had been to destroy everything, leave nothing alive, and treat anyone present as the enemy. Between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers were killed. Most were women, children, and elderly. Many women and girls, some as young as 12, were raped before they were murdered. One ditch alone held more than 70 bodies. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr. was flying an observation helicopter low over My Lai when he saw what was happening below. He landed between a group of U.S. soldiers and a group of terrified civilians and ordered his own gunners to open fire on American troops if they continued killing. He evacuated survivors by air. A small number of other soldiers refused to fire. Later, they helped bring the events to light. The operation was reported up the chain of command as a military success. 128 Viet Cong killed. The unit was formally congratulated. It was not until Seymour Hersh published his investigation in November 1969 that My Lai became known to the American public. Photographs surfaced of women, children, and infants piled in ditches. 26 soldiers were charged. 25 of those charges were dropped or resulted in acquittals. Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty of murdering 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison. He served 3.5 years under house arrest at Fort Benning after President Nixon ordered him released pending appeal. Captain Ernest Medina, accused of giving the original orders, was acquitted. Running simultaneously across the Mekong Delta from December 1968 to May 1969 was a separate operation that almost no one has ever heard of. Operation Speedy Express was recorded as one of the most successful campaigns of the Vietnam War. The Army reported approximately 11,000 enemy killed. American combat deaths numbered 242. The kill ratio was presented as 45-1. On paper, it looked decisive. The Army recovered approximately 750 weapons from the dead. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 of those killed were unarmed civilians. The operation had relied on helicopter gunships, artillery, and fighter bomber strikes across a densely populated region designated as a free fire zone. David Hackworth, one of the most decorated officers in the U.S. Army, stated openly that a large number of innocent Vietnamese civilians had been killed because of the command's drive to produce the highest body count. A 1972 Newsweek investigation found that in one provincial hospital, 3/4 of all civilian wounds treated had been caused by U.S. firepower, not Viet Cong action. No charges were filed in connection with Operation Speedy Express. In 2003, photographs taken inside the Abu Ghraib detention facility in Iraq were leaked to the press. They showed detainees stripped naked, forced into humiliating positions, threatened by dogs, and mocked by soldiers posing beside them. The body of Manadel al-Jamadi, killed during interrogation in what a ruling classified as homicide, was photographed packed in ice with soldiers grinning above him. The Bush administration stated these were isolated acts by a small number of rogue soldiers. The Red Cross reported that the majority of Abu Ghraib detainees were civilians with no established connection to any armed group. Internal documents showed that senior officials had approved what were called enhanced interrogation techniques. Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez had separately authorized military dogs, extreme temperature exposure, reverse sleep schedules, and sensory deprivation inside the facility. Sentences for those convicted ranged from a reprimand to 10 years. Most fell below 3. On November 19, 2005, a Marine convoy in Haditha was hit by a roadside bomb that killed one Marine instantly. Within hours, Marines had shot 5 unarmed men, pulled from a nearby taxi, and entered surrounding homes. 19 civilians were killed inside their houses, most shot at close range in the chest or head. The youngest victim was 3 years old. A 9-year-old girl who survived told investigators she had watched her grandfather shot first in the chest, then in the head, before her grandmother was killed beside him. 8 Marines were charged. By 2008, nearly all charges had been dropped. The only Marine punished admitted to negligent dereliction of duty, lost rank and pay, and served no prison time. On September 16, 2007, a Blackwater security convoy opened fire on Iraqi civilians in Nizor Square in Baghdad without warning. 17 people were killed, and 20 more were wounded. The FBI concluded that at least 14 of the 17 killed had been shot without justification. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in federal court. One received a life sentence. The others received 30 years each. In December 2020, President Trump pardoned all 4. United Nations human rights experts stated the pardons violated U.S. obligations under international law. The charges across all of these cases run to the dozens. The number imprisoned for any meaningful period of time is a much smaller figure. This is what one survivor of My Lai said, recalling the moment soldiers reached her family. "Everyone in my family was killed. They threw me into a ditch full of dead bodies. I was covered with blood and brains." At No Gun Ri, the U.S. funded a memorial and offered $38,000 in compensation to some families. At Wounded Knee, where more than 250 Lakota were killed in 1890, 19 Medals of Honor were awarded to the soldiers who carried out the operation. In 2025, the Defense Secretary announced those medals would not be revoked. In each of these communities, what followed was enforced silence. Not for years, for decades. And then investigations. And then charges that went almost nowhere. And then normal. The documents are available. The inquiries are on record. The pattern has been confirmed repeatedly by the United States government's own investigators. The files remain open,